right. Welcome, everybody. We'll start off the Legislative Audit Commission, the Executive Subcommittee. We'll kick it off. And before us today, we have a few tasks. First off is going to discuss and consider an adoption of a performance evaluation, which we've had a couple versions. I have to apologize for the feverish actions, but I think we have a really good plan in front of us today that we should be able to discuss thoroughly. And then we're going to go through the discussion for the appointment of Mr. Nobles, as well as our deputies for consideration for the full committee on November 15th, I believe. So with that, Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a little bit for the record of chronology here. So there was a chair's proposal that was put forward, and then Senator Cran had an amendment to that, and Senator Rest did a delete all, and that is in your packet and was posted earlier, but 2019-PR parentheses 003 parentheses. And I think the way that is written, that could be moved, because I think there are a couple tweaks to that. So I would move as the policy entitled 2019-PR 003 for the performance evaluation plan and procedures.
Great. Representative Hanson moves. Senator Rest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some oral amendments that are just corrections, if I may. If members have the document in front of them. On line 10, we want to strike the word not. The goal is to have the two people be a chair and vice chair. It's not in statute, but be of opposite political parties for the purpose of this evaluation. Then on line 28, page 1, the name of the organization is the National Conference of State Legislatures, not legislators. So that's a strike and insert. And then on the second page, line 14, after the word auditor, insert in consultation with the chair and vice chair. So that would be my amendment to this document.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Senator Rest, you made the proposed oral amendment. Any discussion? Voting members? If no discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Adopted. So we have we've got the motion. Any conversation or any discussion on the Senator Rest?
Yes, I would like to maybe explain where I was coming from with this and taking the original document and how to move forward. And in particular, thinking of it possibly as a model procedure. In my discussions with Senate Counsel, it became clear, and with others, that we really don't have a formal evaluation process of any senior nonpartisan legislative staff. It just doesn't exist. It's not that we don't have evaluations and conversations, but it's a very informal scenarios. So it may well be that and I mentioned this in my note to you folks, that other commissions, and Representative Hanson has already pointed out to me privately that there is an evaluation of the Outdoor Heritage Fund, is that it?
Outdoor Heritage Council.
Yeah, the Outdoor Heritage Council. That does exist, but not some of the others. That this might serve as a model for that. We looked into timelines, and it seemed to me that in the original document, or maybe it was the second generation of the document, that there was a requirement to put in place or to have completed an evaluation by June of 2020. But of course, if you work back from that, the period of evaluation, given that we are going to appoint an auditor, would have been not a year, but barely 2 months or 3 months. And so that the period of evaluation, an annual evaluation begins, the year begins, or the year to be evaluated starts on the appointment and then the anniversary of that appointment going forward. And then different things happen in the third year that Representative Hansen had asked for more thorough, not just an evaluation procedure or process by the commission itself, but that there be an outside independent evaluation. And one of the issues there, and they have addressed it with the Outdoor Heritage Fund in terms of budget, is who would pay for that. There was an original suggestion that it be done by MMB, but that is clearly a conflict of interest for the legislature. And so at the Legislative Auditor's request, that was just changed to an independent outside entity of some sort. I do believe now that on an annual basis, moving forward with that timeline, that the year to be evaluated would end November, whenever it is we're doing this, 15th, 17th, whatever, 17th, 2020. Then the evaluation process for that year is taken up and completed according to the timeline that's in the document, which I think is possible because the Executive Committee sets forth the timeline, and they certainly, even though the anniversary date is the 17th, there's no need to have it done before Christmas. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. And but the Executive Committee sets the timeline, and that could vary from year to year. However, particularly in the even years when we don't come back right in January, might want to wait and so forth. So there's some flexibility there, and and we are paying attention to the help that we get from NCSL, and I think that this document 003 represents the spirit of both chairs, but it works, and the timetables work. Laws are adhered to, and it can become, and I would be happy to support this as a policy of the Legislative Audit Commission. And I'm happy to answer any questions about any components or why something was changed. Didn't use the word incumbent auditor, just used the word auditor because it was redundant to say incumbent auditor because there's only one at any given time. So some word changes like that I don't think harmed in any way the intent of the document.
Thank you, Senator Rest. I think you did. You've accomplished and achieved the intent of all of our conversations. I appreciated the bipartisan nature as well that you added to make sure that we preserve that throughout the entire process. So thank you. Anybody else comments? Representative Liebman?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I am kind of, I appreciate Senator Rest's work on this, but there are some aspects of it that are changed that I kind of wonder about and don't necessarily agree with. So, I don't know if I should maybe go through what some of those are through the whole document. First of all, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't have the original document in front of me. just the one that here, the one that was modified, and then the delete all. But, so we've moved from, right now, we do essentially no evaluation of the auditor to going to an annual evaluation. And this evaluation under this document would be by the chair and presumably by the chair and vice chair, and I want to get into that too. I think going from, first of all, doing an evaluation could be a significant amount of work. And given that we've gotten along for all these years doing none, I don't see why we're going to annual, would be the first thing. And maybe, Senator Rest, rather than answering each thing, maybe you want to just make note. That's my first thing.
Yeah, I'm making a note.
On line 11, where we just did the oral change, and that's fine, I understand the intent is that we have a chair and a vice chair from both parties, or if they're not of opposite parties, that we get somebody else. But I think the way this is written, it says if the vice chair is a member of the same political party as the chair, then the LAC must designate the members of the LAC who will conduct the assessment. In other words, the chair's out now too. I don't know if that was intended, but I would say we should be designating the second person of the other party and make that explicit, not remove the chair, because the chair is still the chair. So that would be another one.
I'll respond to that, too.
Going down to line 22, where you've changed 360, a 360-degree evaluation to a comprehensive analysis. I know we had some discussion about that. I'm no expert on this, but I don't think it's the same thing. And what I understand a 360-degree evaluation to be is one where you're getting input from everyone who interacts with the person. So especially it's important to get input from people who are their subordinates. And I don't know that that is brought forward with the term comprehensive analysis. And I think it's really important where you have, let's just be real, I mean, this is an extraordinarily important position. And I think that there are a lot of aspects to the work that the auditor is called on to do, not just outward-facing work, but also managing this department. And I think it's really important that we that we get some assurance in an evaluation that the people who work for the person have confidence in him or her. So that's part of why I think it's really important to do a 360. And if we call it something else, fine, but I don't think comprehensive picks that up. My next thing. Line 24 has been turned into a may there, and may include observations and feedback provided by the auditor's staff. So if we're getting rid of the 360, but we're also not even requiring that there be anything besides the written self-reflection and the way this is now worded. And I think that's troubling, because I think having a written self-reflection is fine. Maybe we should have that every year. But a real evaluation, I think, really must include, and I think the original language was stronger and said maybe.
No, it says may.
It said may also? Okay. But regardless, I think that was implied in a 360. And I think it really should be part of the evaluation. So that, let me see, I think I had one more. Okay, on the back page now, I wanted also to have a comment about this idea of an independent entity. So this is, of course, tied up with my contention that we probably don't need an annual evaluation, certainly not a full evaluation. But I am given a little heartburn by the idea that we, the commission, are not going to be the ones doing the real evaluation, because he works for the legislature, and we're the group of legislators who are responsible. And I could very much see us contracting with an outside entity to help us do an evaluation. But turning it over to an outside entity, I would not be in favor of that. I don't know who is contemplated in this, but I do not think we should outsource that responsibility.
Okay, may I respond?
Senator Rest.
Thank you very much. With regard to the points that you raised, I was not trying to undermine at all Representative Hansen's document. He called for in his annual performance evaluations. So I did not go after that at all, left it as annual, what would happen annually, as opposed to also his suggestion, a midterm, even more thorough, comprehensive evaluation that would be done similarly to what is done, I've since learned, at the Outdoor Heritage Fund, where they have an outside evaluator give a report to that commission. So it was in the spirit of that was offered. So that's the annual thing. The 3-year thing also was something that Chair Hansen had suggested, and it's kind of like a really taking stock, even though we had done these annual evaluations, that there may be an outside look might be very helpful to the Legislative Audit Commission in directing their work. Representative Hansen had suggested MMB, and as I mentioned, that is clearly, and was brought up by the Legislative Auditor, a conflict of interest, and that is not the place for us to go. If we don't, as a group, consider that third-year evaluation point to be important, I quite frankly defer to Representative Hansen. You know, I was not trying to do away with the things that you had, but you know, I would appreciate a comment from you on that. With regard to that 360 thing, as I indicated in my comments at the last meeting, it is jargon, and maybe comprehensive is not the right word, but to call something 360 and hold that out to the public without explaining what personnel people think about that seemed to me to be, I don't know the word, snobbish, if you will, or you have to be an insider. And I really didn't like that term. Maybe comprehensive can be improved, and that was part of the 02 document as well as my 03 one here. The issue of the chair and the vice chair, and trying to make sure that the people are of different political parties, that just like the composition of the commission, that is so important to reflect the bipartisan, no political party majority rules the day, that I thought it was important to make a point of that. What probably should happen is, although in statute the chairmanship of the commission goes back and forth between the Senate and the House, there is no further explanation of how that works. By tradition and by comity, we have had the chair be of whatever chamber, the chair be a member of the majority party, and in the other body, it be a member of the opposite party. Often that has meant a member of the minority party, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to be someone of a different party. We would have a different situation, it seems to me, if somebody tried to make mischief. That's not mine. Tried to make mischief and had a chair and vice chair of the same political party. Now, maybe they never could get those votes, but I think I I don't think it's harmed by being explicit. Let's see. In line 24, that's no different than what Representative Hansen's original document was, and I didn't change it. He has a must in the first part of it, and then may after that. And to me, to say auditor staff does in line, also in the same line, indicates those who are subordinate to the auditor and the deputy auditors. So they're not left out at all by using the word comprehensive and then indicating the must and then what things may be included to get to that comprehensive evaluation. But with regard to the third year, I defer to Senator Coran and Representative Hansen on, I didn't change that, on what you see the value of an independent outside, and even in your original language, that's what you were getting at, it seemed to me, by going to MMB, why you think that would be a good thing. So some of the things that questions you are raising, Representative Lieveling, are not my changes. They were part of the original document.
Thank you, Representative Lieveling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Rest, first of all, you may be entirely correct that some of the things I pointed out were in the original. I don't care who they came from. I just think we need to discuss it and make it work really well. So that's fine. If I'm critiquing some of Representative Hansen's work, I think he can handle it. But I think you're maybe misunderstanding my point on the line 11. I totally agree with you that that we want to make sure that our two evaluators are of opposite parties. But I'm just saying, pointing to the way this is written with that change, with the oral amendment. I'm sorry?
Senator Rest.
No, well, yeah, I just want to make sure that we're getting at where we really want to go with the language. So right now it says, if the vice chair is a member of the same political party as the chair, the LAC must designate the members of the LAC who will conduct the assessment. So it sounds like if it happens that the chair and vice chair are the same political party, that suddenly we throw out the idea that either of them is one of the evaluators, and then we pick two people who may or may not be the chair. I'm just saying we should still keep the chair and maybe pick another person instead of the vice chair in that circumstance. That's all.
Senator Rest.
If we said maybe if the vice chair is a member of the same political party as the chair, thank you, the LAC must designate I think that the thing is, must designate must designate a member of to serve in lieu of the vice chair, if they're both the same, someone from the other party. That's
Exactly.
That's the intent here. And maybe if it must designate a member in addition to the chair who will conduct the assessment. Does that do it?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Bodden.
Senator
Mr.
Rest and Representative Lieveling, I think the way this was drafted, at least my understanding would be that the chair and vice chair would be included in the term members. So the LAC would be free to select any of the members to provide that service. At least the way I had written it was intended to remain very flexible. Certainly, if you want to be more prescriptive and designate exactly what process needs to occur and whether the chair or the vice chair needs to be replaced, you could do that. If it would give you comfort, I could suggest an additional sentence that would make it clear that for the purposes of this policy, members includes both the chair and vice chair.
Senator
think that is, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that is, well, I hope if we could do the latter, that would give some comfort to Representative Liebling. That the point would be, the chair would be there, and if it just so happened that the vice chair was of the same political party, the LAC would choose a member of the political party opposite to the chair's political party to conduct this particular function. Only with regard to
Yes.
this particular function.
Exactly.
So could we ask Mr. Bodern to do some language that would do that?
Mr. Bodern, and this is a suggested oral amendment that you're crafting. Do we want to allow Mr. Bodern to craft that and then continue our
And go on to something
conversation?
else,
If you want to craft that or spend a few minutes, or do you believe you have?
So, Mr. Chairman, I think I have something ready, but I'll try that and perhaps need to spend more time with it if I understand Senator Rest correctly. This would be an additional sentence to be inserted on page 1, line 11 after the period, which would say, for the purposes of this policy, in quotes, members includes the chair and vice chair. And I think if I understood the discussion correctly, but maybe if I missed something, this would give the full LAC, it would preserve discretion to select whoever they thought was appropriate to perform this function.
Which we do now.
Yeah, Senator Rest, so with that, it doesn't sound like it materially changes it at all. So,
Whatever you like.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Representative Liebling?
Thank you. Well, maybe it's not that important, but I mean, I thought the idea was that this is a function initially for the chair and the vice chair of this commission. And if it turns out that they're both the same party, you want the vice chair to be replaced, not the chair. So that's all. So that language doesn't do that, because it basically says if you both happen to be the same party, it just opens it up and then the two of us can do it. And that's not, I don't think that's the intent here. I mean, if somebody's the chair of this commission, I think when they take that position, they should understand that one of their key roles is going to be conducting whatever evaluation has to be done.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rest?
I would suggest that at the beginning, Mr. Bodern, that we just delete after the word appointment on line 10 and line 11, and insert a sentence that would accomplish what Representative Liebling was saying. If the vice chair is of a different party, the members of the Legislative Audit Commission will choose a member of the opposite party to assist the chair in the evaluation. Does that do it? Something like that?
Thank you, Senator Rest. Mr. Bodern, do you want to, again, take a stab at crafting this? I think we have a bit of discussion from everybody on this particular topic, so we want to be able to get everybody in. So if you want to craft, since Senator Rest, you haven't moved the oral amendment, so because we don't have one, we could have conversation, and because I think everybody has a comment. Would you like to?
That would be my intent, but I'd rather have better, more concise language that meets that goal. So maybe Mr. Bodern.
Mr. Bodern, if you guys could do that
Research could
quickly, and then we have on the.
On this point, the language that Senator Rest, with all due respect, has used is opposing party, and I think we just need to use the term minority party just to reflect that the chair is elected as the majority member, so whatever party that person's in, and this using a minority party would imply that we could be dealing with a third-party system too, not just a bicameral. And so rather than opposing, we need to have a designation there that what we're trying to do is, rather than having two members from brand X or party X, we're trying to say X and something.
Representative Pierce, excellent catch. So, Senator Rest?
Sorry. The other issue with that in the past has been it's been more topsy-turvy in the last decade. But when we had, when Democrats had both houses, and it was the Senate's term, the chair would be a member of the DFL party, and the House vice chair would be a member of the Republican Party. And it would not be a Democrat, even though they were in the majority. And the same thing was true in the previous term here, when the chair was a member of the, both bodies were Republican, but the chair, because it was in the Senate, was a Republican, and the vice chair was a Democrat, a member of the minority party in the other body, even though they were not in the majority. So, and we've managed to do that without tying ourselves in knots. But if we're going to have a formal thing, whether we bring in that word minority, because, you know, all these people are elected.
And codify it.
And we have had, in some instances, the Legislative Audit Commission has gone without members of one political party of one house because they could not agree among themselves who was going to be on the Legislative Audit Commission. And it got very, very contentious. It was months before we had a full 12-member body. And, I mean, you'd think, well, that shouldn't happen, but it has happened. So I don't know how to make the language clear to accomplish both purposes here, but I certainly support it. And further, it seems to me that we would settle some of this if we change the statute and just said more than just goes back and forth between chambers, but put that policy in place about it should be a member of the majority party and so
Senator
forth going forward.
Representative Hansen just suggested that language, that the chair and vice chair not be a member of the same party. Yes. So if we can consider that or bake that in and include that, I think it does. I think it does.
Put that here?
I think we can bake it in. Do we need any other clarity or any details beyond that for the purpose of this section? Because I agree with Senator Rest that you know, if you would codify it at the governing body that appoints and creates the structure, we would take care of that. But for our purposes here, for this evaluation process and the guidelines, the key is as Representative Pearson brought up, then you know, I guess you do have the minority party, and then you may have others, but you still have the majority and minority, and by default, I think that covers if an alternative or another party comes into existence. Representative Legally?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we're unnecessarily complicating this. I have a suggestion for language here. Just take what we got, and here's what it would read. If the vice chair if the vice chair is a member of the same political party as the chair, the LAC must designate a member of the LAC from a different political party to act jointly with the chair.
Senator Rest?
This is a suggestion from Mr. Bowden, which is very similar. It just says, if the vice chair is a member of the same political party as the chair, the LAC must designate an alternate member of the LAC of a different political party to work with the chair in conducting the assessment.
Perfect.
Does that work?
Absolutely.
Then, Mr. Chairman, I
Right.
move to strike. Move to strike everything after the period, following the word appointment, the rest of line 10 and 11, and insert the language I just read.
Senator Rest moves that oral amendment. Discussion on that amendment?
Do you want to just read it one more time?
Sure. If the vice chair is a member, let's go back. So after, thank you. So it starts out with the chair and the vice chair acting jointly in the first line, or in line 6. And then after the language, to replace the language that was stricken, if the vice chair is a member of the same political party as the chair, the LAC must designate an alternate member of the LAC of a different political party to work with the chair in conducting the assessment.
Any
Okay,
further
that's my
discussion?
amendment.
No further discussion. All voting members to Senator Rest's oral amendment. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Amendment carries. We have next tonight, so we have Senator Klein, Representative Pearson. Do you still have additional comments? And then we have Representative Hansen. Senator Klein?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to kind of go point by point through Representative Liebling's concern about document 003. I'm indifferent to the timing on the annual performance assessment. I'm open to the wisdom of the committee on that. I feel that a comprehensive analysis that includes feedback from auditor staff covers the concerns about substituting language for 360 analysis, but I would suggest that we consider changing the may in line 24 to a must. I would think that would be appropriate. And then I feel very, very strongly about the independent evaluation every third year. I think our evaluations of necessity are going to be colored by relationships and also by the fact that we don't have professional HR experience here on this committee. And I think this will be an important test every third year to sort of add an outside voice and some competence to this evaluation process. And then that document will be reported back to each member of the LAC as I see it in the language here, meaning that we will have final oversight and voice on what is done with that evaluation. So I would strongly support keeping that language in. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Klein. Senator Rest?
Thank you. I don't have any problem with changing myself from, and I defer to Senator Representative Hansen, may to must, because I think it's going to happen anyway. So, I'm happy to have that word must. I think we do need to keep in mind that the third, and I agree with you, the independent, the third year midterm evaluation it's not something that's every 3 years. It's within the 6 years, there's a midterm evaluation. And then when we get to the 6th year, we have this process that's within the previous document of going about the reappointment and then, or the appointment. And then it's another 3 years, because we've done these annual things, where we have that independent thing. So we don't have an independent evaluation in the 3rd year and the 6th year. I just want to be clear that that's what was Representative Hansen's intent. But, Mr. Chairman, I would move to, on line 24, strike may and insert must.
Senator Rest moves the oral amendment to strike may and insert must. Discussion? Anybody? No further discussion. All voting members, all in favor of the oral amendment?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you, Senator Rest. We've got Representative Pearson.
Yeah, the conclusion of that, that was outside of the may and must motion that was just made, is really hitting to the point that I think I want to make. And in some ways, the opening language in line 9, we're always covering the year following the anniversary. And in some ways, that's helpful. Obviously, you've got this snapshot in time. But as far as that final 6th year appointment, having that evaluation after the anniversary is too late, and we can't make that decision. And actually, your discussion of saying the 3rd year evaluation wouldn't happen during the 6th year, in some ways, I would almost roll that back and say, well, it would be infinitely more helpful to us if that preceded that 6th year. And in some ways, I think we need to revisit the whole concept of the evaluations taking place after the anniversary, and we need to have a discussion of saying maybe the evaluation process is a month preceding that anniversary, so we can look at, and of course during our first shot here, it might just be an 11-month window, but we really need that amount of time to have, especially if we were having an outside consulting firm. I think that would be infinitely more helpful for this committee to have had a professional HR staff to do that during the 6th year term. And again, I don't know what our costs are, and I don't know what's fully contemplated there. But it's certainly less helpful if the evaluation is after we've reappointed an individual on their next 6-year term.
Representative Hansen to this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Representative Pearson. I think, and maybe this could answer a few questions or a few of the comments on it, that the annual performance reviews is kind of looking at what is done throughout state government, whether it's in the executive branch or even within these agencies, that you have an annual performance review. And I'm looking at it, when I was a supervisor in state government, we did it before the anniversary date, because then you would approve that, and there was usually a salary increase or something went along with the anniversary date. Originally in the document last week, I had the comprehensive, not 360 degree, that last year, and I think it's a question of what do you use that for? Is that review for the commission to judge the employee, or is the evaluation at a midpoint where you can provide correction or input during a 6-year term? Because a 6-year term is a long term. In state government, it's longer than the governor's term, it's longer than all of our terms. So based on the discussion and thinking, looking at having the midpoint, so you're in the middle of that effort, let's say something goes wrong. Let's say in 10 years from now, there's an employee that is in the position and it's not working out, and you have that opportunity where there's for feedback and coaching versus having that evaluation at the end of it where you're using it on whether or not to reappoint. So I changed it to the midpoint from what I originally had proposed at the end, where it's kind of evaluating for reappointment. I agree the way I intended it, and the way Senator Rest is saying it is that it would be a midpoint evaluation. And so you would have these annual evaluations, and I think you're right, Representative Pearson, that if you, in that last year, you want to have that evaluation before you make the choice. And you would have that also with a 3rd year evaluation. We're all in this, we don't know if we'll be here 2 years from now. So it's a 2-year, the commission changes every 2 years. So when you have that evaluation in the 3rd year, you're in the middle of a cycle rather than at the end of a cycle on the outgoing. I do think that just walking through with elections, not talking partisan, but if we are going to do annual evaluations, it should be the commission that is sitting during that year before that is doing that evaluation, rather than a new commission who hasn't had the experience of serving with the positions. So I hope that added some I agree with what Senator Rest has said, and I think we can, these are not insurmountable
Yes.
time issues, but I hope this helps answer back to Representative Liebling's question. If the annual is there and you're looking, we have nothing now. And then that provides consistency of how did the year go, what are we going to go ahead? And we're formalizing that rather than doing it verbally. And then that midpoint is how are things working, where you're getting the input from a variety of sources.
Senator Rest?
Thank you. I think I absolutely agree with Representative Pearson here, and I think the place to address it is on page 2 with the first bullet point there, where we start talking about the appointment process and the reappointment, and somehow in the sentence that begins on line 3, in the year preceding the expiration of the auditor's term, that we insert something there that the evaluation timetable should begin 6 months prior to the anniversary date. And so that last evaluation would occur at 5.5 years, or based on 5.5 years, so that the LAC would have the opportunity of the annual ones on the anniversary date, the third-year one, a fourth-year one, and then in the middle of the 5th year would start the evaluation of the whole term, preparing to make a recommendation, or not, maybe not recommendation, but the reports would be available so that prior to that anniversary date of November 15th, the Legislative Audit Commission would have the opportunity and not be rushed like we are now, up against a deadline, to do it. Alternatively, we could have the mid-year evaluation, we could have a 4th-year evaluation, and then we would not just have a 6-month, we would just make the evaluation that occurs on the whole period of the appointment to start during that last year, without just saying it would be 6 months. I mean, but there's some, we can shorten that last year period so that we're not up against the gun for the appointment. And maybe we could even make the appointment in July, even though it would be, the anniversary of it would be in November if we thought so. Probably not that soon, but you could do that. What do you think?
Representative Pearson?
Well, I think all of it's a good discussion to contemplate, and there's pros and cons to that. One thing I'm just observing, though, too, is 3 years from tomorrow is Election Day 2022. So timing-wise, it's not necessarily the best for this commission to be trying to gather and evaluate a 3-year, just again, looking at the math, and so maybe an adjustment of when all of this is happening.
After that. I mean, you look at a whole year,
Yeah.
12 months, and then sometime maybe in January or February, you provide the evaluation of the preceding year. You can't do it overnight.
Yeah, and I think it goes to the whole, all of this is good discussion, and I'm not married to any of it. I'm really just trying to think through, because again, my initial point was that we're talking about always following the anniversary, with the exception, again, we'd really love that evaluation prior to the reappointment or contemplation of reappointment in that last year. So I just think there's some finesse and worthy discussion to be had there. So that's my thought. And again, just that happenings of, your point, Representative Hansen, of it being 3 years, and that just happens to fall on an election year, which, again, not that anyone would ever take an opportunity to politicize something like this, but it.
We actually don't.
And I sincerely was saying that, so, but, you know, the temptation would certainly be stronger should that timing be so placed.
Thank you, Representative Pearson. And from my perspective is, I think that we get tied up in the annual review process, but when we come to that reappointment, we're really backing into, you know, what are the guidelines for those that succeed us, and how can we at least put a structure out there? Here's a list of activities that you need to perform, and here's the activity, here's a time frame, a recommended time frame to adhere to.
In the last year.
Yeah, in the last year, because it's really about the reappointment, right? It's no longer an annual review. Because I look at the annual reviews as, one, a performance, right? But a formal touch base. We touch base, and everybody it works well because we've had a personal relationship based on the staff that are here. But for those that serve in these roles, that I think we need to be more involved, and I don't mean that in a negative manner, but I think we need to be more involved in making sure to understand and provide guidance, or at least be informed about all of those activities that occur, some which the Office of the Legislative Auditor plans for, right, based on their mandatory requirements. But then there's a whole host of discretionary activities that ebb and flow based on, you know, what occurs and what hits a headline. And is that really how we should be operating, or should we be taking a more active role in making sure that we are all more well-informed about how that process moves forward? You know, in just laying out an outline, to me, that's what I see that being. And so the other comments as far as the comprehensive review, I think Representative Lieben, you mentioned about having an outside, as I read the report, that we want to make sure we preserve the determination of criteria sought, right? Audience pursued, you know, as we want to make sure it is wide or as narrow as we want. But that it does include all of the partners that have a role or an interaction, but that we are not giving up any authority to anyone to reproduce a report, but do the data gathering elements of it in a professional manner in an organization that can then gather and collect it, and then we produce the report for recommendation for appointment or non-appointment. So that it just, you know, I think that's the intent. I think to the 360, it has an industry connotation to it, and so I don't want us to be bound to some connotation that may change or morph in the public environment relative to something that we intend. I think comprehensive in nature and that we determine and we control, I think will accomplish the goals that we're looking for. So, so with that, any other comment? Representative Lieben?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, you know, I agree with where you just went with that. I'm not opposed to the idea of getting an outside entity to help us. I would like a little more clarity about the intent around what happens in the annual and what happens in this 3-year. I'm sort of a little bit following the discussion, but don't have a stake in the ground on the timing. You all are more kind of thinking more deeply about that than I am. But I do have these kind of two concerns. One is that I do think it's good for everybody to get some kind of an annual review, but I just don't know if we want to do we have in here this comprehensive language now and all of that as an annual. And I just, that's a big, I'm just concerned about the workload, knowing that, you know, everybody who's a chair and vice chair here is really busy also. You know, I just don't want us to take on something that we can't do realistically. So that's one thing. So we may want to think about what gets done during an annual review as opposed to this deeper dive that we do, where we engage an outside entity, as you say, Senator Cran, to help gather the data. But my concern with the outside entity is I really think that, I mean, this says comprehensive analysis of the auditor's performance to be conducted by an outside entity who's not part of the legislative or executive branch. Well, he works for the legislative branch. I mean, I agree that MMB, that's not a good thing. Fine, there's a conflict, we don't want that. But he does work for us, and we are supposedly directing his activities. And so absolutely hiring somebody to help us, because we don't have the time or the expertise, that we know. But to hand it off to someone really, I don't think we should do. The fact that we're a bicameral, bipartisan body, and we all, I think, as far as since I've been here, people try very hard to be about, good government. That's what the legislative auditor fundamentally is here for, to help us have the best government we can have, right? I think we all share that goal, even though we may come at it differently at times. But I really think this is our job to do that, not some independent body. And there's nothing in here to even suggest who that might be, and I'm having trouble imagining who it would be. It should come back to us to do that, to direct it, even if we hire somebody to do interviews or whatever.
Representative Hanson.
Thank you. Now, and maybe this would help provide the example, and Senator Rest, the LCCMR is going through a similar process right now with every 6 years they're doing a strategic plan. So they did contract with MMB Analysis Division. Previously, Outdoor Heritage has done that for looking at work plan and strategic planning and checking back. So there you have, and I'll just use them because this is the example. They came in and met with the chairs, directed the outreach. There were public meetings. There was a meeting in Rochester that we had, but they also did a survey where people could comment about priorities for the LCCMR. So there was, but at every step away, there was guidance from the positions with authority, but not the people in authority doing the questions. And we are treated differently as elected officials. And so having that, just as the auditor often is in a position of having people who come to the audit staff and want anonymity, then the people who audit the auditor should also have people who have the protection of anonymity. And so people may view us differently, and we're public. So I believe we can keep the authority and have a contract for someone to do that. And what we did with LCCMR is it's in the budget. We had a line item that there was going to be money for the strategic plan, and it went through the legislature and it was voted on. And we're voting on it, do we need to, there's some discretion there on how do we appropriate that money. So as we go through the next year, we have two opportunities. One is, as we talked earlier, is setting policies in place of how do we deal with policy, not the performance on things, and then dealing with the budget. So next year we go, so in 2020 during the summer, hopefully Representative Pearson before the election cycle gets started, but looking at what are the recommendations for the budget, working with the auditor and the deputies on that, and we could build in the budget request of how do we do this type of thing. All of this is new for us because we haven't done it. And we may find the annual performance reviews, or we demonstrate the annual performance review. This commission will demonstrate by practice the annual performance review. It'll be the next commission that demonstrates how to do that, but we're setting up the guidelines on how they can do that. So the idea is to get that independent assessment from a variety of sources on what it's doing. I'm not going to formally recommend this, but I think there's a value of, I think the auditor has done a good job of starting to do emails, the weekly updates of what is happening with the legislature. I think the webpage can be broader. I think there can be more public engagement. Maybe we need to do a survey for the general public on what do you think the legislative auditor should be looking at, or some type of public engagement, because this commission has great power that we delegate to the employee to do great things, and they're important things. And I think as we move through this, we are going to evolve practices that at least are something to start with. And so I would ask that we adopt this today, and that I think there may be a change that could be made based on Representative Pearson, the input before the next meeting, but it also gives us an opportunity before next week to look at it. We would post this again. But I think the annual, and I would ask maybe this is something when we get formal comment. We had the other, Mr. McCormick and company all commented last week on this. I think Senator Rest commented that this could be somewhat precedent-setting because we all focus on our jobs. I agree with you on that, and there's limited time. But setting up some structure may have a benefit, not just in this commission, but in others, so that we're acting like regular businesses or regular other government operations to have some public accountability. I don't know if that helps, but.
Thank you, Representative Hanson. Any comment, Representative Liebling?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Hanson. I guess I'm just a little uncomfortable with the wording of that section about conducted by an independent entity. It just sounds like we're just completely outsourcing the thing. And, and I just would like a little language that more closely reflects what Senator Cran was talking about and what I think you're talking about, which is, I'm completely on board with what you said about, people who can get comments that aren't us. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. But I just want to hire somebody and have that budget and hire people to work with the chair and vice chair and, bring back the data. I mean, I think maybe the substance is the same as what's written here, but I'm just uncomfortable with saying we're going to bring in somebody independent to do this and just give us a report. That just doesn't quite feel right to me.
Senator Rest?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really associate my feelings about this with Senator Klein's about what an independent entity is. But as Representative Hanson says, what we're doing here is providing this framework going forward, and it may well be that when this gets to the full LAC, that we have other issues that we haven't thought of, and/or in
Be a trainer.
the coming years. I mean, we're laying out a framework for 6 years of evaluation right here. And in the next legislature, they may come back to this. The new LAC, which may include some of us, may not include others, and say, we're going to revise this document because it no longer suits the goals, because we've had all these conversations and so forth. I am not at all, however, uncomfortable with the notion of an independent entity. That's what happens with audits themselves of private companies and businesses. It is someone who comes in from the outside that is given a work plan, that is given, and of course they have their own rules and regulations, but essentially is given a work plan of what the expectation is by the hiring entity, and it can be at very different levels of full-pledged audit. It can be something less than that. These are CPA audits now, and there's like a management agreement about exactly what's going to happen and what's going to be looked at and so forth. And it seems to me that it's at that point that the chair and the vice chair work out the agreement with the independent entity of what it means to have a comprehensive analysis of performance. But I think we should, I agree with Representative Hanson, I think we should leave this alone for right now and keep thinking about it. The timetable element, however, that Representative Pearson brought up, I think is a thorny, a more immediate issue that we should get our hands around of what happens in that final year. And I don't know that we can do that right this minute, but it should be, that paragraph, I would agree, should be looked at before, or at the next level, and see if we have better sense of the timing, so that we can make the appointment or reappointment, as the case may be, well, no, it actually only works for a reappointment, because if it's an appointment, we're not evaluating past performance on the legislative auditor's office in general. So it really only deals with the reappointment process in that six year, if the person who's currently the auditor wants to be considered for reappointment.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Representative Hansen?
I was going to renew my motion that 2019-PR number 03 as amended be recommended to pass to the full commission with a request that Representative Pearson work with council on developing language to achieve his intent on timing.
Thank you, Representative Hansen. And so you renew your motion. Any further comments? Representative Pearson?
Yeah, the only comment, I mean, the document does in a way does accomplish that without specificity, and I think if you go to line 13, the assessment must result in a report that may be used by the LAC in guiding the work of the office. And in the next line, it's, in the year before the auditor's term expires, the assessment may be used for making decisions about the appointment of the auditor. The issue is that that report would be after the 6th year term, and so that I think is where we need to look to edit to find our solution in when that final report comes out. And this discussion, I hope, will help the council.
Agreed. Thank you, Representative Pearson. Representative Liebling?
Well, Mr. Chair, I'm still uncomfortable with this, and I have to say, in response to Senator Rest, I think an audit is really different than outsourcing a performance evaluation of your employee.
It's just a term of art.
Well, I think it's a different thing, and I don't know where we've done that. I mean, I guess I'm uncomfortable essentially voting to what looks like language to outsource an evaluation to an independent entity, and I understand that that's not the intent of the language, because I think we could tweak it, but I just, maybe if we can, I mean, the full audit commission is going to look at this again. I don't want us to be here all day wordsmithing it, so I'm willing to give it a pass right now, but I'm uncomfortable. I just really want to say I'm uncomfortable approving that, and I don't consider my vote to pass this on an approval of that language, because I think we need to be much more concise about that.
Thank you, Representative.
I don't think that the public expects us to outsource that. And I know that's not the intent, but it sure sounds like that's what we would be doing.
Thank you, Representative Liebling. Any other comments? With no further comments, Representative Hansen renewed his motion to adopt PR 003 as amended. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Policy is adopted. Senator Rest?
Mr. Chairman, may we instruct Senate Council and House Research to prepare the document that we just adopted?
Thank you, Senator Rest. And so, yes.
There's my
consulting.
Mr. Bodden and staff, I hope you have gathered all of the information so you can produce the final document as amended for us. Thank you. All right, so thank you, everybody. It was a good conversation. I think it's really good that we get a structure in place. I think the structure does put in place a guideline for those that succeed us and sets clear expectations, and I think carries forward that level of transparency that we all want and accountability. And I think the inclusion for me as well. For anybody new coming in this process, there are no guidelines, there are no rules, and it's baptism by fire, right? So to give people in all of these roles a guideline on what to expect is, to me, extremely valuable. And I think we did a good job at that. So with that, we have now consideration of the legislative auditor, Mr. Nobles, Mr. Boozy, and Ms. Randall. Come on down. Mr. Nobles, would you like to go first? We have, in everybody's packets, we've included your resumes, and we appreciate all the information you've provided. And so, Mr. Nobles, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Executive Committee. Again, for the record, my name is Jim Nobles. I'm Legislative Auditor. And I want to start by thanking you for considering my request to be reappointed. I also want to thank all of the people that have helped me over my years of working for the Minnesota Legislature. Been many legislators, many staff, partisan, nonpartisan, House, Senate, and I wouldn't be here without all of that support. As I came into this building, I came in on the basement floor, and I reflected on the fact that 47 years ago, that's where I started. That's where my office was. I had a desk up against one of those big foundation stones in the basement of this building. And I think that was kind of emblematic for me because I felt that my role was not to be up on the top floors in the chambers where all of you make policy and you engage in the political process. My role, I've always felt, is down there trying to help build the infrastructure of state government so that when you make that policy, that infrastructure will carry it out. And fortunately, I've had an opportunity over the years to work on many of those fundamental principles of good government. And I agree very much with Representative Liebling. That's what it's all about. We're all here in our capacity, different capacities, to try to achieve good government. You do it by getting elected, representing your constituents, the interests, and often the very conflicting interests that you have to deal with as legislators. Our role is to provide you with information. And I remember back in, if you don't mind me just reflecting very quickly, that I started in House research working on something that was, again, gathering information for the legislature, for the governmental operations committees in the House and Senate, to try to improve the rulemaking process. And I remember getting so excited about that, the Administrative Procedures Act, rulemaking. And I remember some of my colleagues saying, Nobles, what's wrong with you? Why are you so interested in this very detailed, very boring Administrative Procedures Act, the rulemaking process? And I said, well, to me, this is about a fundamental principle of due process, giving the public access to the processes of government. And rulemaking is a very important part of that. In fact, we even call it quasi-legislative. So I felt like it was not only necessary to tighten up that process for public access, but once you pass policy and turn it over to the executive branch, you've turned over some of your legislative authority. And as we know, rules, if properly promulgated, have the force and effect of law. So that's kind of where I started, and then I came to the Office of the Legislative Auditor and have been able to continue working on, again, fundamental principles. And I consider some of those fundamental principles that we work on every day: separation of powers, checks and balances, and accountability. So thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunities that I've had over these many years. I do want to continue this work, but just because I want it is no reason for you to reappoint me. So let me just, in a few sentences, tell you what I think I can bring to this work and continue to bring with it. That is, obviously, after the years that I've been here, I can bring some experience. I can bring some times that I've gone through where we've had to navigate through a variety of complex situations. And so I bring that experience. I also bring the experience of actually doing the work. I don't sit on high and manage the Office of the Legislative Auditor. I get down and do the work. And that's the way, at least I think, I need to be as Legislative Auditor. I conduct interviews. I review documents. I write reports. I do that to try to be an example of what I expect others in the office to do. I try to meet the same goal that I expect others to meet, and that is to produce a report at the end that is thorough and fair, accurate, objective, timely, and useful. So if that is what I expect of others, that's what I have to do myself. And we do it collectively. I certainly don't do it on my own. We do everything collectively. And so when I write a report, it's reviewed by others. When I have findings, I have recommendations, we work on those things together, because no one of us is going to be perfect. But as an organization, we have to get real close to that perfection. So I will also bring a very deep commitment to the functions of this office, and I believe in them, as I've said before, as the fundamental principles of good government. I also will always set high standards within the office. We have to abide by those because of generally accepted auditing standards, but also just because of those are the expectations that you have and the public has. I also will work very hard to create an office in which we are respectful, that we are respectful of the people we audit, evaluate, and investigate. Yes, sometimes that can be a little bit contentious, and we have to have some degree of skepticism as auditors, but we don't have to be disagreeable with people, and I don't think we are. I think we maintain a high level of professional respect for all of those we come into contact with, and with legislators and the legislative process. I often talk to classes at the university and at MnSCU and other places, and I talk about the essential challenge of OLA, and that essential challenge is basically to be a nonpartisan professional office in this very partisan environment. And one of the ways that we do that is to do our work, do our job, meet the standards of issuing reports that are accurate, objective, timely, and useful, but also to have a respect for you as elected officials, other elected officials, the governor, the administration, but also for the legislative process. And I have to tell you that after 47 years of sitting with a front row seat, of watching you and your colleagues work through what you do, I sit here before you with great respect that you're here, that you work for the public through very complicated, difficult issues. And then often you go back and ask them to reelect you. And that's an assignment that, frankly, I would never take on. Again, I want to work down in the basement on the infrastructure while you work up in the top floors making the policy. That's what I have to say, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to answer questions. I do want to, once you consider my reappointment, talk to you about the two people that are sitting here with me.
Thank you, Mr. Nobles. Members, questions? Senator Klein.
Mr. Nobles, thank you for your eloquence and your dedication to the task. I simply wanted to observe that you started by the foundation stones in the basement of the Capitol, and I believe that area could also be described as the part of the Capitol where the bodies are buried. Perhaps that also is emblematic of your work. I do not know, but thank you for your work.
Thank you, Senator Klein. Senator Rest.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I join Senator Klein in being appreciative of the work of all three of you, quite frankly. And that goes back to the work of Mr. Boozy when he was a member of the staff of the OLA some years ago as well. And really led us through some analyses of cybersecurity that was so important to the legislature a number of years ago and continues to be the case. I do support the notion of additional accessibility that I hope that you're working on. Representative Hansen mentioned a more expanded website or that is more user-friendly to the public. And I don't know what that would look like, But I hope that you'll put your brains together, and the folks in your office that work on that kind of stuff, of engaging members of different communities in the public of what things could be different that would make the OLA's website more accessible to a variety of users. I think Representative Hansen really made a good point on that, and I support it. But thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Anyone else? Representative Hansen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I have a couple questions, one on the past year or years, and then looking forward and if you are reappointed. So one of the concerns I've heard is, and this I think relates to the special reviews, is a prejudgment or a pre-statement publicly at the point of taking the assessment on, and that a neutral, maybe a better statement is the legislative auditor has received your request and we will be considering that, versus this agency or there's a problem here, we know there's a problem at the point of initiation. And I'd like your reflection on that past, that I'm hearing that from other members and concerns about standards for auditors, making sure that we're not prejudging or not making a pre-indication at the point of initiating a special investigation or evaluation or a financial audit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Hansen. I think that is a very important point for us to hear and for us to always be mindful of. This comes up a lot. It came up yesterday. There was an article in the newspaper, again, about DHS. And we typically, whenever a reporter is getting ready to print a story about the Department of Natural Resources, Commerce, DNR, whatever it is, they often call us, and then they want a comment from us. And the reporter usually says, we have found 200 violations of the law. What are you going to do about that? Now, it does present a complicated situation, because now the public is going to read that the newspaper says they have found 200 violations of the law. And I agree with you. I don't know that there have been 200 violations of the law. I have no idea. But I know that the public is going to read that, and the public is going to wonder, well, is anybody going to look into it? Is anybody going to do an independent assessment? And so it's an important question of how we craft that response and how it is reported. Now, over the years, we established a policy, and it is our policy, to never commit to an investigation or a special review before we have done a preliminary assessment. That's our policy. And yet it is often reported when I or others say, well, we'll do a preliminary assessment. It is often reported the legislative auditor is going to conduct an investigation. So that's one point. I think the other, and I probably am guilty of this, that when I hear from a reputable reporter that he has found 200 violations of the law, my first reaction is to say, that concerns me. And that may be interpreted that I'm endorsing what he is saying. But it does concern me in this particular case that I knew that there were internal documents that indicated that there were these contract violations. I had previously been aware of that. It comes from a whistleblower that I've interviewed. So when it comes up, I may already have some knowledge. And so I did the correct thing, I think. I turned it over to Mr. Boozy to respond to the reporter. To be serious, I think we really have to make sure that nobody thinks that we have decided, that we have a prejudgment. We often go into these situations that have been reported, and we find something quite contrary. Whether they're reported in the news or come to us from legislators, I have conducted a number of investigations, special reviews, where legislators came to me and said, I want you to investigate this because this person did this thing. And they were sure that they had documentation that that had occurred. And we accepted the request and found the contrary. So the ultimate judgment is going to be based on the facts as we find them. But I agree that initial response, where we're called by a media person and what we say gets reported is very important. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I really take to heart what you said. I think we always need to be very cautious of every word we utter. A number of you, and I much appreciate that you have suggested to me on times to always be very cautious of every word because they have power and influence and effect. I realize that. We do typically, certainly when we conduct a special review, an audit, or an investigation, we have time to very thoughtfully consider what words we're going to use. But sometimes when I pick up the phone and it's that reporter that wants a comment on the fly is when I think we really absolutely have to be careful and cautious. And my colleagues later, once you're finished with me, may want to comment on that because, frankly, they sometimes take those calls as well.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as my follow-up or question looking forward, I think leads a little bit from your answer, and that is when you mentioned that you have policies, and so the policies on dealing with a special review, has the commission ever adopted those policies? Are they posted on the website? Those are the things that I'm looking forward, at least from a commission perspective, in the coming year, that some of these standard operating procedures actually get the approval or modification from the elected representatives and that they're posted so that the public and the media, who are members of the public, can see that this was considered and this would be there and what the base of my question was going to be. I looked at your position description and it has 20%, 20%, 20% on the financial audit, program evaluations, and investigations. And I think that ebbs and flows, but I think there's concern that the investigations may be taking more and more time, have fewer staff working on them, and how, when we get to the 5% for supervising the budget, how does that wrap in? So that kind of gets into the running of the office with your position description.
And Mr. Chair and Senator Hansen, we have not over time added any increased staff to do investigations or special reviews. When I became legislative auditor, there was a director of investigations. And there was one person, and then when investigations were launched, a team would be created. And some people would be drawn out of the financial audit division, typically never out of the program evaluation division. So we would typically use a financial auditor or two. And that's kind of the way we've continued. Now, what I have done recently, and that is appoint a director of special reviews, so that we have somebody, and it's Joel Alter who's here, very senior member of our staff, who can make that preliminary assessment. Like I said, our policy is we don't conduct a special review or an investigation until we've conducted a preliminary assessment. And that's what Mr. Alter does, and we come together as a team, the three of us sitting here with Mr. Alter and with our legal counsel, and review all of the concerns and allegations and requests for investigations that have come into our office. I think we're now at possibly around 100 for the year.
300.
230. Well, that includes data breaches. So purely requests for things that could be an evaluation or an investigation. allegations of misuse of public funds. But we do get all of these data breach notices, and we have to pay attention to those as well. So let me just respond to your point about being more accessible. The policy that we have on conducting investigation special reviews is on our website. So the process that we go through, the criteria that we use, and we have a form that people can fill out to request an investigation, a special review, or simply give us allegations or concerns. And so we have formalized that over the years. People can call us, and they do. They can come in. I accept your request that we become more accessible and that we open ourselves up more to public input for what they would like us to look into. I can only tell you 200 or 300 will go to 400 or 500. Mm-hmm. And that's fine because we are the office that is the independent, nonpartisan office that can look at these issues that are going on in state government or in nonprofits or other places. So we welcome those suggestions, but we do have to have time and staff to thoughtfully go through them, assess our jurisdiction, set priorities, and then make that determination, Mr. Chair. Are we going to pull people from other assignments? How are we going to get the job done if we decide we are going to launch an investigation?
Thank you, Mr. Nobles. Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a quick follow-up, or we do consider that we have more staff, we just ask for more in the budget for dealing with special rather than pulling them from other positions, and we formalize that process. That could be another method. But I did have a different question completely separate from that, and that's we recently had the audit relating to that dealt with tribal governments.
Yes.
And I know that the executive branch has been going through formal tribal consultation training. I think they've been having the heads of agencies, and I guess I would ask your opinion as a legislative branch for you or your deputies and staff to go through that training, because as the agencies are involving more, what is the role? We're in the legislative branch. We are not in a government-to-government consultation, but to go through that training, I would like your opinions on participating in that, and if you would do that.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hansen, I welcome that suggestion and will follow that. Having gone through just within the last few months a lot of interaction with the tribes and the tribal issues, I think that would be excellent for us to do. Some of our other audits and evaluations have at times put us in contact with various tribes, and so I think it would be something that we would really benefit from, and I will commit to you that we will do that.
Thank you, Mr. Nobles. And any other comment? Representative Liebling?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few issues, Mr. Nobles, and I just want to say quite frankly that I am reluctant to vote for your reappointment. And I've spoken to you about some of these issues, but I just want to bring them out here today. And I do have a real respect and appreciation for the difficulty of the work that you do and that the office does. I really do. And there are many times when I'm very grateful for, over my entire career, for the kinds of work that you've done and the way that you've assisted us. But some of my concerns really are around this. I appreciate that you are nonpartisan, but bias does not only mean bias toward one political party or another political party. I think being neutral really does mean more than just being nonpartisan. Some of my concern really is related to what Representative Hansen was raising about how certain things are selected, and I appreciate your explanation of that. But part of what my concern is that sometimes I feel that the reports, I don't have a concern about the way the investigations are done, and certainly I The staff, from top to bottom, I have found to be absolutely stellar, whoever I've had interaction with. But I am concerned about the level of what I would sometimes call editorializing in the way the reports are done, especially these reports that are in response to something that's been in the headlines. Because sometimes, very frankly, it feels to me as though you're playing for headlines. And it's one thing to respond to the press, and the press, we as elected representatives and senators, we get calls from the press and they say, what do you think about this? Here's some information, and what do you think about it? And I've certainly been asked many times about something I never heard of before. And so we understand what that means, and that you have to be very careful, and sometimes you say, well, if the facts are as you say, then I would be very concerned about it, because as we know, it doesn't always turn out to be what it appears at the beginning. But I just am concerned about what I see as a little bit of, for lack of a better term, mission creep in the way these things are being presented. And I feel like I'm seeing it more in recent times than I used to, or at least maybe I didn't notice it as much when I was less involved in it. But I really believe that the usefulness of the work of the staff is diminished by value judgments that are put into the reports that I believe are not the place of the office to make. And it makes it harder for us, I think, as representatives and senators to use the information when it comes loaded with value judgments. And so that is a concern, and I've spoken to you before about this, so this is not a surprise to you. I have a second concern, too, and that is one that I need to explore a little bit more. Maybe I could just ask you about it. You just mentioned that this most recent thing in the Star Tribune, or in the newspapers, about I don't know how we even, what word we can use to describe it, the $50 million problem now, or that they described it that way in the paper, which I think was kind of inaccurate, but that there are these forms that are being kept, and you just said that you knew about them. So, well, I didn't know about them, and I am concerned that a few things have come up recently that you've described, or your reports have described as systemic issues at DHS. Here's another one that's something that's been going on for quite a long time. You knew about this one. And your office is doing evaluations. You're doing audits of DHS all the time, which is great. It's a big, complicated organization, spends a lot of money. We need that. But somehow you seem to be missing certain things that are systemic things that are going on there until the press knows about them. And then it's then we're all, oh my God, how could this be happening? And it seems to me that, maybe I'm missing like what those general audits are that are going on a continuous basis, but my understanding is that those were sort of supposed to catch some of these things early and head them off before they go on and on for a number of years, especially, now I understand that you're not going to catch every little problem. That's a given, and you mentioned that in a previous meeting, that's a given. But something that's a systemic management type issue, in the reports that are often done by your office, probably under Mr. Busey, where they say, are the controls adequate? Well, you're examining what the systems are to make sure that we don't get into problems. And yet in a lot of these DHS situations, your office seems to have missed the systems problem. And that is really a concern to me. So those two things coming together, it's a systems problem that the office is missing, so that we let it go on way too long, and then there's this kind of headline grabbing, the reports written for the headlines, which really I think takes away from our ability to do in a nonpartisan way to try to get to the bottom of what's going on and make the fixes that we need to make. So I guess I will give you an opportunity, but those are two deep concerns of mine that I am really struggling with as I sit here.
Mr. Nobles?
Mr. Chair, Representative Liebling, thank you. And we have talked about these, and So let me just talk first about the value judgments. And absolutely, you in several recent reports have seen judgments by the Legislative Auditor's Office about the conditions that we found. We could avoid that. I could have not called the situation that created the problem of the overpayments for Suboxone to the 2 tribes. I didn't have to say that was dysfunction. But as we interviewed person after person after person who works at the Department of Human Services, and when I heard people who were 15-year veterans of that department at very high levels in management say, I cannot stand to work here anymore. This place is dysfunctional. I am leaving. Would you please call this out in your audit so that something will be done, so that the administration and the legislature will say, this wasn't just a mistake. This is dysfunction. This is systemic dysfunction in this department. Those were the words that the people who work there, day in and day out, used. Did I have to repeat them? No. And so if it is the judgment of the Legislative Audit Commission that I should not make those kinds of judgments and categorizations, I'll just let the facts speak for themselves. I think the facts spoke to dysfunction, and that's what I called it. But I didn't have to, and it wasn't seeking a headline. It was seeking your attention to this issue so that you and your committee, Representative Liebling, and the Senate committees would dig deep into the problems at DHS, and that the administration would maybe finally pay attention to them. Because sometimes, you know, with all due respect, the tepid language of an audit doesn't necessarily get the attention. I think I can find you year in and year out reports we've issued about problems at DHS and that didn't call it dysfunction and didn't get attention. I'm not looking for attention from the media. I'm looking for attention from you in the legislature and in the executive branch to fix these problems. And I get maybe a little overly passionate about it because we are on a mission of accountability. And when I see that we have people in departments telling me, I can't stand to work here anymore, and they're very talented, experienced professionals, I think it's reached a level where I chose to use that word. Let me address your second point. Yes, I knew about the issue that was in the Star Tribune, and we have it on our list of possible special reviews. This comes from the whistleblower that has been all throughout, and I'm not disclosing anything that's private information. This is Fay Bernstein, an attorney at DHS, who has said that first of all, that when she called out the problem and told her superiors that she would no longer sign contracts because they were in violation of the law, she was walked out of the building. And so she came to us as a whistleblower and said, Legislative Auditor, I can't get anything done within DHS. Can you help us? I'm being harassed for being a whistleblower. Can you help me? Can you help not only me, but my colleagues? And then some of her colleagues came to us. And I can't mention their names because they asked for confidentiality. So yes, I knew this problem was there, and we had it under consideration, have had it under consideration for several weeks. But we had to finish the Suboxone issue and a lot of other things first. We may pick up on that issue, or we may not. It's going through a preliminary assessment. But that's why I say I knew about this problem, but I didn't have the vehicle to report on it because we haven't really done the fact-finding. I have her allegations in a recorded interview, and I have interviews with other people that are confidential, but I can't disclose those until we go in and find the facts and substantiate, is she right? Is the Star Tribune right? So that's the choice that not only we have to make, but I would like to make with you. Representative Liebling, do you want the Star Tribune editorial or headline to stand as fact? Or do you want us to find out what the facts really are? I mean, that's sometimes the choice, is that there are headlines that are wrong, that are just flat wrong. And so do you want them to stand as what the public reads as fact, or do you want them independently investigated? That's the choice that we have to make. And if you want to be a part of that, we can work out some mechanism for that. But that's what we do every day, every week. We decide, are we going to let that headline stand as fact? Or is somebody going to really do an in-depth, independent, professional, nonpartisan investigation and determine what the facts are and report them?
Thank you, Ms. Nobles. Representative Liebling?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to respond a moment. First of all, I wasn't complaining about the use of the word dysfunction. I never said that was my problem. You know, I mean, if there's a dysfunction, there's a dysfunction. I don't think that's a value judgment. I think that's, I would call that a word about a fact. You know, a mistake, there's a mistake and there's dysfunction too. And I think we're in agreement that there's dysfunction there. So that is not my issue. I think, though, that there is a way that these things are written. And, you know, if you're trying to get our attention, I just would like to say that oftentimes it really doesn't seem like it's that. It seems like it's about getting the headlines. And you just said it's about, you know, should this headline stand? Well, I would say that I don't think your job is deciding which headlines should stand. I think your job is helping to call out what's going on in state government and applying some, you know, telling us what the facts are. That's what I think your job is. And that's, I think we maybe have a disagreement about that, and that's what I'm struggling with here. You know, I think there is, you know, frankly, I think that sometimes, you know, we sometimes in the legislature talk about term limits, and I'm not a proponent of term limits because I think voters have the right to elect the person they want, no matter how long they've been there. But I do think there might be something to the fact that sometimes, you know, sometimes we need change in other positions. And I'm just, you know, again, I'm not, I think there are many things that you do very well, Mr. Nobles, but I am really troubled by this one. In terms of the thing about these forms, I guess I didn't understand that you had only known about them for a week or whatever, a short period of time. I thought you were saying that you'd known about them a long time. So that's a different issue. But nevertheless, I think part of what we look to the office for is kind of an ongoing assurance, spot check that the systems are there, that the systems are in place to try to capture problems before they occur. And that's where I think there's been as I said in a previous meeting, a dysfunction possibly in your office around doing that, because we shouldn't have a dysfunction that goes on from the early 2000s until now with something as critical as who's authorizing payments, or I mean, or what you pointed out, which I think is very, very helpful about the two divisions not properly communicating with each other. But that's not a new thing, and you just got to wonder. We haven't been here, you know, doing that work as long as you. But you know, somehow, I guess I'm wondering if we're capturing this properly, if we're doing the kinds of work that is behind the scenes, but that helps to make sure that we don't get into a 20-year problem of having money go out the door that shouldn't be going out the door. So I'm going to stop there. You don't need to respond, but I just am laying out what my concerns are.
Mr. Nobles?
But I would like to respond because I think you make an excellent point that we talk about, worry about, agonize over in our office all the time. And we are absolutely with you on that question. How can we go into these agencies year in and year out and not find some of these problems? And I think that's something this commission can really help us with. I've talked in the past that I don't think it really delivers an in-depth assessment of what's going on in state government for us to audit the state's financial statements. And we spend an enormous amount of our resources auditing the state's financial statements. the financial statements have to be audited by an independent auditor, and we have been doing it for years. And basically, the executive branch is getting a free audit out of the money you appropriate to us. But that does not go deep into the internal operations of state government. It just says, has the state reported its financial activities and condition according to generally accepted accounting principles? And that's all that really accomplishes. So we are with you on how can we better utilize our resources to dig deeper, as we did in the most recent DHS report or in others. Ms. Randall, for example, was the manager of an evaluation in the Department of Health that again disclosed, and I don't remember quite if you used this word, but in the Office of Health Facilities Complaints, serious dysfunction that had an impact on people's lives. We've been over doing financial audits in the Department of Health before. We never found that problem. We found it through an evaluation that dug deep into the operations, the management, the supervision. Took, 2-3 people, months and months, to dig that deep into that organization. We would like to do more of that work, because that's where I think you find the real serious dysfunctions that can. But I must say, Representative Liebling, sometimes we dig deep and we don't find problems. And they don't necessarily get reported. That when we issue a report without, serious findings, if you look through a lot of our reports, we find a lot of good things going on in state government, and you're going to get some of those reports again this year or next year. But every once in a while, when we're at the Department of Health or at DHS or somewhere else, we find some real serious problems. But that can only occur if we have the time and the resources to dig deep.
Thank you, Mr. Nobles. Mr. Nobles, I appreciate your comments, and as it relates to the recent topic, I've been in government 37 years now on both sides. And so my brief experience here in this elected role has shown me nothing except that your organization, not only do you function to do the work of the people, I think people get lost in the fact of what the role of the legislative auditor does, and that it's really about the functional aspect of the delivery of our services, right? It's not the executive body. It's, in fact, not even in many cases the temporary administration of the operations, of the appointments, the appointed leadership within the agencies. Certainly isn't a reflection on the political aspect of this body and the elected body. And I think when we talk about, I think you mentioned at the last statement, Representative Liebling, about, they just didn't find it. They're not designed to find operational programmatic dysfunction by whole, on whole. And I would, in my experience, and again, I think I would love to work with you on the greatest challenges the Office of the Legislative Auditor has is finding the expert levels that we know who delivers our services, how, when, where, and not only did we meet the statutory requirements, do we have the controls in place, but how are we actually doing, providing any value? I think they are a body that could do that. Most agencies lean on them to tell them, well, thank you for your, discovery of dysfunction or not dysfunction, but lack of process or controls. And but it goes beyond that. And so, and I was going to say it in our last meeting, but we look at it as a partisan attack. It's no way a partisan attack. It's a business model which causes these things to evolve. In the world of DHS and Department of Health and Human Services, or Department of Health, these things are critical. It's life. You know that better than anybody. It's life and death, and it's our most vulnerable who are impacted by these things. In others, we've got great people, but they're just jobs in DHS to many people. They do great work, but they're not attached. They're not attached to the decisions we make. They're not attached to the decisions that are implemented or policy or rule that's propagated through the agencies down to people who actually deliver the services, whether it be in a hospital, nursing home, group home, PCA service, you name all of the various things that we do. We have a level of, we have a need, and I think we're dancing around symptoms again of a of a system that's designed to produce the results we're currently seeing, right? I think you're looking for the word before. What was the word about the 200? It's 200 violations of law, called breaking the law. And those things, we've now codified it, and we've kind of normalized. Well, we're okay. But if you just fill out a form, we're good. And as a taxpayer, we're here to build trust. They're here to identify, and in every case I've seen in deep dives, the office has always given the benefit of the doubt to try and not be a headline leading agency that says, oh my God, is it all broken, right? Because we don't want the citizens to lose all trust in everything we do. And so I would welcome the opportunity to work with you to really dig down in helping. One, I think that's the annual review process will help us dig down more in depth about how do we make this nonpartisan body function in a manner that we can get the statutory requirements as we know and believe them today, but really start to get down, and it's thinking about changing how we deliver everything we do in government and instill in a training process that teaches them what their job is. I can show you over and over proof that it doesn't exist today. We've got great people. It's not the people, but we have a process that allows this to be to create headlines. And those are only things that float up to the top and through an investigated, and it's happenstance in most cases. And so we need something far more systemic, and that's our job to do that. And I think with the help of the legislative auditor and maybe some things we can do to move down to those high-level areas, DHS is probably one of them because it affects lives. When MNLARS doesn't work, it's an inconvenience. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to discard it, but it's an inconvenience. And this is life and death of our most vulnerable. To me, I think the reason government exists. And so I appreciate the work that you've done, Mr. Nobles. I think the one thing that I took away from our last meeting was you were highly qualified. I think your staff and the operation of the organization reflects the tone in which you've set. But it goes much deeper than that. And I think you covered almost 3 or 4 minutes of the things you have to do to live in your personal life to maintain the nonpartisan nature and to remove the opportunity in this very partisan world to be attacked, to be perceived as being biased in any way, shape, and form. That affects you and your family and your personal life that I don't think most people understand. And I think that reflects and continues to build the trust for us that you're doing the job that we expect. And so I do appreciate those things. I don't think I don't think most understand this. And then the last thing I'll say before I'm finished is kind of the education piece. I think we have a huge role. I think we're talking about part of it today. I don't think everybody understands the role and what you actually do. So to be able to help us as a legislative body, in different terms, lay out how deep down do you dive, and all those things. But then, especially for the public, I don't want to flood you with 5,000 requests that take you away from that. But we have a great confusion between the Office of the Legislative Auditor and your role, and that it's digestible for our citizens as it relates to our state auditor. And so there's that confusion there. So I would agree with the goal to increase educational opportunities and the transparency and especially transparency from the agency itself. So with that, Mr. Nobles, if you have any comments.
Mr. Chairman, I just appreciate that. I really want the public to understand. I want legislators, everybody to understand who we are, what we do, why we do it. I try to take every opportunity I'm given to be before committees, Rotary clubs, whatever, and the more the better, because I feel very strongly, passionately, and very grateful about the creation of this office and the work that we do. It is, I think, ultimately a service not only to the legislature but the public, and so the more they know about who we are and what we do, the better.
Thank you, Mr. Nobles. Senator Klein?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make a motion that Mr. James Nobles be appointed to be Legislative Auditor for a 6-year term ending November 17, 2025, and that Christopher Busey be
I
Deputy.
think we're going to do them individually. We're going to give them an opportunity, I think. Senator Klein.
I'd be glad to make a motion for the panel.
Okay.
I guess I will continue with that motion.
All right. Senator Klein makes a motion to appoint James Nobles and to a 6-year term, reappoint, and Deputy Auditor Christopher Busey and Ms. Judy Randall. Any Conversation? Questions? Senator Rest?
The motion is in the form, thank you. The motion is in the form of a recommendation to the full commission.
Yep.
I just want to clarify that. Thank you very much.
Representative Liebling?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm really sorry that that Senator Klein is doing it this way. It's separated on the agenda, and frankly, I was going to abstain from Mr. Nobles's recommendation, but I do want to vote for the other two. So it does put me in kind of a difficult position with regard to that. I don't know. Senator Klein, what's the problem with having two separate votes?
Senator Klein?
Representative Liebling, to address your concerns, I'd be glad to withdraw that motion and offer instead simply the appointment of James Nobles to a 6-year term.
Senator Klein retracts his original motion and modifies it to appoint, for consider appointment and approval to the full committee, the appointment of Mr. Nobles, legislative auditor, for a 6-year term. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion carries.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Klein?
I'd like to offer a motion to appoint Christopher Busey and Judy Randall to be Deputy of Legislative Auditors, and that recommendation to go to the full committee.
Senator Klein makes a motion to approve Legislative Deputy Auditor Chris Busey as well as Deputy Auditor Judy Randall for approval upon approval to go to the full committee. Any conversation? Representative Hansen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be quick. I think the deputies had heard my questions before, so I'd like them to each respond to the question about tribal consultation, and then also maybe more clearly stating, is there a need for a third division for special review? So there'd be, next time we did this, 3 deputies there, 1 for special review.
Mr. Busey, would you like to go first?
Mr. Chair, committee members, when it comes to learning more about tribes and how to interact with tribes, I am all for any type of training that we can have to understand their culture better, how we can interact with them. So anything that's put forth for our organization or for other members, or other bodies in the legislature, I am all in favor of that.
Thank you, Mr. Busey. Ms. Randall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, for the record, my name is Judy Randall, Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Program Evaluation Division. I think it's regarding getting more training on working with the tribes, I think it's a fabulous idea. It's actually something that I started to look into this past year because some of the evaluations that we are currently working on, we have had interaction with the tribes, and I think we have tried hard to be respectful, but I think we could use some training on the best way to approach it. I do know about the executive order for agencies and have talked with some agencies about it, so I think it's a great idea. Regarding Representative Hansen's second question about whether there's a need for a third division focused on special reviews, I don't know. I guess I would want to think about it a little. It's certainly becoming a bigger focus of our attention internally, and I think there are several ways we could structure that internally, whether it needs to be an official division in law with a third deputy. I'm not sure that that makes it a lot bigger and would either significantly shift resources or require significantly more resources for that to fully make sense in my mind. And certainly I think that's something we'd all, I don't want to speak for the other two up here, but I think we'd all be willing to entertain that, but I think it has larger ramifications.
Thank you, Ms. Nobles. Senator Rest?
Just a clarification, if there were to be a third deputy auditor, we would need, just like the difference between the chair and the vice chair, we would need a statutory change. The 3 of you could not create another deputy auditor without there being a statutory change. And as I understood Mr. Nobles, he has assigned Mr. Alter as a director, but that particular position did not need statutory authority to put a manager and head of those things. But if it's going to be a deputy auditor, subject to appointment, then it has to be a statutory change.
Thank you, Senator Rest. And Representative Ham, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you talk about the third division, I think we're looking about function, right? and how do we, what are those tasks? And so I would like to work, have spoken, I think we have a need to expand, and part of my previous comments about how do we get to that program level knowledge and expertise. And so I think that it falls in line with that. And so I think we could work together to try and to put that focus. It's probably a DHS issue that I would start, just from the fact that to build a team that is expert level knowledge, to be able to dig down into some of those areas that we just don't have coverage at all today. And to really, because it can take a long time to build expertise, one, just to function within government, and then two, the complex program knowledge. And I wouldn't limit it to just the agency. I would look at it a little bit deeper dive, and I know it's a little different role, but we were expanding it in cyber technology and systems and recommendations, but that we actually go out and expand the role a little bit to go into the audit of the value of the service and the delivery of the service, even those that are externally based. And so I think that would be something we could do a really good job on that would help us get to those areas that allow us to deep dive and not chase headlines, and then not chase, or to be in a better position that we're identifying core challenges before they become headlines, and get those and put training and policies and procedures in place to eliminate those things. So I think they're all tied together. And again, it's why I'm here. That will be my mission for as long as I have the pleasure to serve here. So with that, any other comments? Senator Klein?
Mr. Chair, just to close, I wanted to thank you for your leadership on this manner, and really maintaining the integrity of nonpartisanship in this, and solution-based discussion rather than political scorekeeping. So thank you for the work you've done.
I appreciate it, Senator Klein. I'm here. I never planned to be here, as most of us haven't. So, but when we're in positions where our backgrounds matter, it's all about getting the job done. It's not about chasing it by party. There's enough politics. We don't worry about that later. But I am here to bring value to our government delivery vehicle system, because I look at it and say, again, are we working to solve our problems? Are we less looking to produce legislation that deals with the symptom? And so me, it's all about getting to the root cause, and every one of these things are all interrelated. And so for me, I appreciate the comments, and we'll continue to operate in that manner. So with that, Senator Klein renewed his motion to accept and move with the recommendation to the full committee the appointment for 6 years of Deputy Legislative Auditor Christopher Boozy, as well as Judy Randall. All those in favor say aye. 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 Those opposed? No. Motion carries. I think we appreciate everything that you guys have done. I think we would love that you carry forward the same bipartisan nature and do the great work that you've continued to do. And you always have my commitment, and I think everybody here, that it's what's best for our citizens. And I think we can, with the structure that we just put in place today, that I think will leave for our successors a good foundation, that everybody has clear expectations of how we move forward. And with that, I think we do have one other. Do you have another comment, Representative Hansen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd ask members to look in their packet at A2-HRD. I don't want to bring the previously adopted policy forward, but Senator Rest pointed out this might actually answer the question. It doesn't talk about independent, but it talks about neutral and has authority there. So between now and next week, I'd ask members to look at that, and maybe this is something, Representative Liebling, that would help with that. And
Thank you, Representative Hansen, and thank you, Mr. Nobles, and your staff, and Ms. Randall. We do have one member of the public who would like to make a statement. Mr. Heller.
That is not in part of our
Sorry,
procedures.
Mr. Heller. They've just been informed that we don't take public testimony at these particular meetings. So I'm sorry about that. You and I can speak later. And with that, we have no further motion before our committee. We're adjourned. Thank you.